There is a specific kind of loneliness that belongs only to the people who outlive everyone they came up with, who watch the friends that shaped them and the collaborators that defined them and the brothers in all but blood that sustained them disappear one by one across decades until the circle has narrowed to a single person standing in a space that used to hold a crowd. Willie Nelson is 92 years old. His lungs have failed him. Pneumonia has come back for him more times than most people survive it once. His body has given him every legitimate medical reason to stop climbing onto a bus and driving to the next show. And yet he keeps going, night after night, wrapping hands that have played guitar for more than 8 decades around the neck of his beloved Trigger and singing songs that carry the voices of people the world has already lost. The question that most people ask about Willie Nelson at this point in his life is how he is still standing. The more accurate question is what he promised the people who are gone, and why that promise will not release him. Willie Hugh Nelson was born on April 29, 1933, in Abbott, Texas, a town small enough that its population could fit comfortably in a single city block, according to his documented biography. He was raised by his grandparents after his parents separated when he was young, and those grandparents taught him guitar in the way that people in that circumstance teach children things, not as enrichment or entertainment, but as a gift that cost almost nothing and could not be taken away by poverty or bad luck or any of the other forces that routinely stripped everything else from families like his. He was picking cotton in the fields around Abbott before he had an opinion about whether he wanted to, and the music he made in evenings after that labor was the only part of the day that belonged entirely to him. He began performing publicly as a teenager and spent his early adulthood writing songs in Nashville that the industry found too unconventional for the polished commercial sound it was trying to produce, a judgment that would later look like one of the great miscalculations in the history of American popular music. The friendships that would define the most important chapter of his life were not formed in a single moment or place, but accumulated over years in the specific environment of country music in the 1950s and 1960s, when a group of people who all came from nothing and all had something genuine to say found each other and recognized, without necessarily articulating it, that they were building something together that none of them could build alone. Waylon Jennings was born on June 15, 1937, in Littlefield, Texas, according to his documented biography, and was performing on local radio by the time he was 12 years old, not because anyone had organized a path for him, but because he had things inside him that needed to come out and music was the only available channel. Johnny Cash was born on February 26, 1932, in Kingsland, Arkansas, and grew up in Dyess, Arkansas, in conditions of genuine rural poverty, singing gospel music with his family because it filled something that hunger could not touch. Merle Haggard was born on April 6, 1937, in Oildale, California, the son of Oklahoma migrants who had come west during the Depression, and built a body of music that documented the lives of working-class Americans with a directness and specificity that nobody before or since has quite replicated. Chris Christopherson was born on June 22, 1936, in Brownsville, Texas, earned a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University, and then walked away from a promising academic career to write country songs in Nashville, a decision that produced some of the most enduring compositions in American music, including Me and Bobby McGee and Sunday Mornin', Comin' Down. Glenn Campbell was born on April 22, 1936, in Delight, Arkansas, the seventh of 12 children, and learned to play a guitar his father ordered from a Sears catalog because it was the only gift the family could afford that year. None of them were supposed to escape where they came from. All of them did. And the thing that bound them was not simply that they all made music, but that they all knew exactly what it felt like to come from conditions that most people in the industry they were entering had never experienced, and to fight for every single note against an establishment that was not interested in what they were trying to say. That shared understanding is what made the friendships between these men something more than professional relationships. It made them a form of mutual sustenance, people who kept each other going when the industry failed them and the money ran out and the recognition came slowly or not at all. The loyalty that operated between them was rarely announced publicly but was visible in the specific ways they showed up for each other when it mattered. When Nashville was rejecting Willie's songs as too unconventional, too sparse, too uncommercial, it was Glenn Campbell who believed in him and acted on that belief in concrete terms. According to multiple documented accounts of that period in Willie's career, including Willie's own reflections in various interviews over the years, Glenn provided him with a publishing deal and paid him at a rate that reflected genuine belief in his talent rather than what the market at that moment said he was worth. That intervention happened at a point when Willie's prospects in the music industry were genuinely uncertain, and the difference it made was not small. Willie has returned to that moment throughout his life, not with sentimentality but with the kind of quiet recognition that comes from understanding what it means to be saved at exactly the right moment by someone who did not have to do it. When the IRS came for Willie in the early 1990s, the debt that had accumulated reached figures that made serious news coverage, eventually totaling over $16 million according to documented reporting on the case, and the government seized nearly everything he owned, including his recording equipment, and auctioned it to cover what he owed. Glenn called him during that period and offered him a slot on his show. The payment for one night's work was enough to keep things functional for another stretch of time. And then Glenn never mentioned it again, which is the specific quality of generosity that defines the kind of friendship these men had, help offered without expectation of acknowledgement, without leverage, without the currency of obligation attached to it. The solidarity that Willie maintained with Waylon Jennings during the years when Waylon was fighting his way through serious substance dependency operated through gestures that were unconventional enough that only someone who understood these men could have designed them. Willie cut off his own braids, the ones he had worn for years, the ones that had become part of the visual identity the world associated with him, and sent them to Waylon through Waylon's wife Connie. It was a gesture that communicated something too large and too specific for words, a statement that said something like, "I am present with you in this, I am giving you something that is genuinely part of me," and the instruction underneath all of it was simply to get through. Waylon kept those braids for the rest of his life, according to accounts given by people close to him, which tells you everything about what the gesture meant and what kind of friendship had produced it. The industry that these men had helped build eventually decided it was finished with them, and the way that decision was implemented said more about Nashville than it did about any of them. Merle Haggard had spent decades writing songs that documented the lives of working-class Americans with an honesty and a specificity that the genre had never seen before and has never fully recovered since his death. When he publicly named the executives who had cheated him out of royalties he was legitimately owed, Nashville responded by cutting him off. His records stopped receiving radio play. His name disappeared from guest lists and booking conversations. According to his own documented statements across multiple interviews in his later years, this unofficial exile from the mainstream of the industry he had helped create lasted for decades. He said plainly that he could not find anything in the new direction of country music worth whistling, which is a specific kind of condemnation from a man who understood music at that level. George Jones, whose voice Frank Sinatra once publicly described as among the finest in American popular music, was invited to perform at a major industry ceremony and then told he would be given 60 seconds to do it, according to accounts of the incident that circulated among people familiar with the story. George Jones, who had spent decades perfecting one of the most emotionally devastating voices the genre had ever produced, declined and went home instead. Some gestures are beneath a person's dignity regardless of the visibility of the platform being offered. Willie watched all of this happen and said almost nothing about it in public forums. He watched Merle get systematically excluded by an industry that had profited enormously from what Merle built. He watched George get offered terms that were insulting to anyone who understood the history. He watched the music that he and his friends had spent their lives making get replaced by something that he and the people he respected did not recognize as the same art form. His response to all of it was to keep playing, which is the only response that could not be argued with, dismissed, or used against him. The truth, he understood, does not require institutional permission to continue existing. The losses came the way serious losses always come, spaced just far enough apart that you almost begin to believe the pattern has ended before the next one arrives. Waylon Jennings died on February 13, 2002, at 64 years old, according to his documented biography. His final words, delivered with a directness that characterized everything he ever said, were an instruction rather than a farewell. "Don't let the boys stop playing my music." It was not a wish. It was a command from a man who had spent his entire professional life refusing to let anyone else define the value of what he made. Willie did not grieve loudly in public, which is consistent with who he has always been, but people close to him said something settled into his face after Waylon died and never fully left. Johnny Cash died on September 12, 2003, less than 4 months after the death of his wife June Carter Cash, according to his documented biography. Everyone who knew Johnny understood that there was no version of him that could exist properly in a world that no longer contained June. In the months before he died, he kept recording, making music that sounded like a man looking directly at the end without flinching. His final music video, a cover of 9 Inch Nails' Hurt, directed by Mark Romanek, is one of the most powerful pieces of visual music documentation ever made and stands as a summation of what he had been and what he had survived across a career that spanned more than 5 decades. Merle Haggard died on April 6, 2016, which was his 79th birthday, according to his documented biography. Willie called him his brother because there was no smaller word that accurately described what Merle had been to him across the decades of their friendship. Then Chris Christopherson died on September 28, 2024, at the age of 88, according to his documented biography, having spent the last years of his life dealing with the effects of Lyme disease while maintaining the same quality of humility and genuine warmth that had characterized him throughout a career that produced some of the most recorded songs in American music history. When Willie heard the news, he said plainly that he was the only one left, which was not being dramatic. It was simply describing the reality of a man who has outlived everyone he started with. What keeps Willie Nelson climbing onto a bus at 92 years old is not a single promise made in a single moment. It is something that was assembled over decades from everything his friends communicated to him before they left. Waylon communicated it with his last words. Merle communicated it with 35 years of refusing to be silenced by an industry that had decided it was done with him. Glenn Campbell communicated it in the final years of his life when Alzheimer's disease had taken nearly everything from him, including his memories, his stories, and the names of his own children, but his fingers could still find the chords on a guitar because the music lived somewhere deeper than memory could reach. The two men collaborated on a recording of Funny How Time Slips Away, a song Willie had written decades earlier when he was young and broke and trying to convince Nashville he was worth something, with Glenn recording one fragile line at a time because his mind could not hold more than that, and Willie adding his own vocal from a studio far away because the two men could no longer be in the same room together. That recording won the CMA Musical Event of the Year in 2017, according to documented CMA award records. Glenn could not receive that recognition in any meaningful way by the time it arrived. Willie has been sitting with that ever since. The work of carrying it forward is not his alone anymore, which is the thing that makes it possible to keep going. Shooter Jennings, Waylon's son, has built his own significant career as a musician and producer while maintaining the connection to his father's legacy and to the broader community his father was part of. Lucas Nelson, Willie's son, was nominated for a Grammy Award in 2026 in the same category as his father, the two of them competing for the same recognition in the same year, which is perhaps the clearest possible evidence that the music was successfully passed to the next generation. Willie has said he hears his own guitar phrasing coming back to him through Lucas, refined and sharpened, which is not a complaint. That is exactly the direction things are supposed to move. Ashley Campbell stood on stage beside her father during Glenn Campbell's farewell tour and played banjo while his memory failed around her, according to documented accounts of that tour, and later wrote music that honored what he had been and what he had left behind. Rosanne Cash has spent her career ensuring that what her father's name means remains present in the culture with full complexity and full honesty. Ben Haggard took his father's band and his father's songs back out on the road because someone had to, and he was the right person to do it. Willie sees all of this. He sees the children picking up the instruments their parents set down. He sees the songs getting second and third lives through voices that learned them from the people who wrote them. And at 92 years old, with a body that has given him every legitimate reason to rest, he gets on the bus and drives to the next show because the moment he stops, the last living direct witness to an entire era of American music goes silent. Every show he plays is evidence that Waylon existed, that Johnny existed, that Merle existed, that Glenn existed, that Chris existed. When he stands under those lights and plays Trigger and sings, the audience is not watching one old man. They are watching the last living keeper of something that cannot be rebuilt once the final thread connecting it to its origins is gone. He knows this. It is the reason he performs. The promise was never about ego or legacy or applause. It was about the understanding that some things are worth more than comfort, and that a man who has been trusted with something that belongs to more than just himself has an obligation to carry it as far as his body will allow.